All right, so in this episode, I'm going to continue with my discussion with ChatGPT about the cemeteries in Puerto Rico. And so I asked ChatGPT, so to continue this discussion about the cemeteries in Puerto Rico, I want to talk about the cemeteries filling up. There's only so much space in Puerto Rico, and the cemeteries are already packed full. There are millions of people living on the island currently, and I wonder, what are they going to do over the next 100 years to deal with this problem that's currently happening and is only going to continue to get worse over time?
Puerto Rico is a small, densely populated island. Many municipal cemeteries are already at or near capacity. Above ground tombs take up a lot of physical space. Families tend to keep tombs for generations, which slows turnover. So, yes, if nothing changed, the math simply wouldn't work. The next century will almost certainly involve a shift in how Puerto Rico handles death and burial. Here's how that is likely to unfold. 1. More cremation. The biggest driver of change. This is the single most likely long-term solution. Cremation is already increasing in Puerto Rico, and over the next 50 to 100 years, it will almost certainly become much more common because it takes up far less space, it is cheaper than building and maintaining a concrete tomb, it avoids the problem of full cemeteries entirely. What this probably looks like in practice. Instead of rows of full tombs, you'll see more columbariums, walls of small niches that hold urns, memorial gardens, shared family niches for ashes rather than bodies. This doesn't mean Puerto Rican culture will lose its relationship with the dead. It will likely adapt it. For example, families might still decorate niches, people might still visit and leave candles. The ritual side of cemetery culture could continue, just in a more compact form. Reuse of old graves already happens, will happen more. This is sensitive, but historically common in many cultures. In crowded cemeteries, municipalities can, and sometimes already do, allow older graves to be reopened after a certain number of years, remove remains and place them in an ossuary, a communal resting place for bones, or a smaller niche or box. This frees up space for new burials. In Puerto Rico, this is likely to become more formalized, more regulated, more common over time. Culturally, this will probably be framed not as erasing the dead, but as transitioning them to a different resting place. Number 3, taller and denser cemetery construction. If traditional above ground burial continues, cemeteries will likely build up, not out. You're already seeing early versions of this. Taller walls of niches, more tightly packed structures, less empty space between tombs. In 100 years, some cemeteries could look more like massive, multi level walls of burial niches, vertical cemetery architecture rather than open landscapes. This keeps the tradition alive while maximizing limited space. Number 4, expansion of cemeteries into new areas, limited option. Puerto Rico could create new cemetery land, but this has problems. Land is already scarce. Much of the island is protected, mountainous, or flood prone. People don't like living next to new cemeteries. So while some expansion will happen, it can't be the main solution. Expect new cemeteries farther from city centers, more rural or hillside burial sites, less scenic coastal cemetery space over time. 5. Hybrid approach. Body burial, later relocation. A likely future pattern. 1. Person is buried in a traditional tomb or niche. 2. After several decades, remains are moved to a smaller niche, a family urn, or a communal memorial space. This keeps the ritual of burial intact while still managing space long term. 6. Cultural shift. What being buried means. Over 100 years, Puerto Rican attitudes toward burial will probably evolve. Right now, many families see a concrete tomb as permanent, sacred, a family legacy. In the future, you may see a slow shift toward viewing ashes as equally dignified, seeing memorialization as more important than the physical body's location, placing greater value on remembrance than on concrete monuments. That's a big cultural transition, but it's already happening in many parts of the world. 7. What happens to the historic cemeteries? Places like Santa Maria Magdalena de Pasis, Old San Juan, Ponce Civil Cemetery, Manatee, Arecibo, San German, etc. These will likely become more like protected historic sites, open-air museums, cultural landmarks. They won't be expanded much. Instead, they'll be preserved. New burials will gradually move elsewhere or shift toward cremation.
As somebody that's walked through many cemeteries in Puerto Rico, it seems like there is a day of reckoning coming for a lot of the cemeteries on the island. And I think the people that are running these cemeteries in the future are going to inherit a lot of problems due to poor planning in the past. Can you go into detail about the problems they are going to run into and how you think they are going to get through it?
1. Pure lack of space, the core crisis. The problem: many municipal cemeteries were planned in an era when populations were smaller. People assumed cemeteries would simply expand outward forever. Above ground vaults were treated as essentially permanent family property. That model is now breaking down. Future administrators will face cemeteries that are physically full, families who expect eternal use of tombs, very little land left to expand into, legal and cultural resistance to changing burial practices. This creates a hard conflict. Open quote, limited land versus unlimited expectation of permanence. Close quote. Number 2, deteriorating infrastructure that was never meant to last forever. A lot of Puerto Rican tombs were built by families, not engineers, with variable quality of materials, without long-term maintenance plans, in hurricane zones and salty coastal air. Future problems will include crumbling concrete vaults, collapsing or leaning niche walls, water intrusion into old tombs, rusted metal doors or gates, erosion in coastal cemeteries, especially places like Old San Juan. Cemetery managers will inherit thousands of aging structures that are unsafe, are expensive to repair, often belong to families who no longer live on the island or can't be located. This turns into both a safety problem and a legal nightmare. Number 3, abandoned or orphaned graves. Over time, families move to the mainland U.S. Family lines die out. People lose track of where relatives are buried. Economic hardship prevents upkeep. Future cemetery authorities will likely face large numbers of neglected or abandoned tombs, no clear legal owner to contact, no funds set aside for maintenance. They will have to decide, do we repair these? Do we demolish them? Do we reclaim the space? If we reclaim it, what do we do with the remains? This will be one of the most emotionally and politically sensitive issues. Number 4, legal conflicts over ownership of tombs. Right now, many families feel like they own their tombs forever. In reality, in many municipal cemeteries, families often hold long-term usage rights, not true property ownership. The municipality ultimately controls the land. Future conflicts will likely include families fighting cemetery authorities over reclaimed or reused plots, lawsuits over moved remains, disputes about whether old mausoleums are historical monuments or public liabilities. Cemetery managers will inherit decades of unclear paperwork and informal arrangements. 5. Cultural resistance to change may be the biggest hurdle. Even if the practical solutions are clear, the cultural pushback will be intense. Future administrators will likely face families who oppose cremation, people who view grave reuse as disrespectful, religious objections, even though the Catholic Church now allows cremation, deep emotional attachment to traditional tombs. So the problem isn't just logistical, it's psychological and spiritual. They will have to balance, open quote, respect for tradition versus the physical limits of the island, close quote. Now, number 6, disaster vulnerability, hurricanes, floods, earthquakes. Puerto Rico will continue to face strong hurricanes, heavy rainfall, landslides, earthquakes. Future problems will include flooded tombs, washed out or collapsed graves, coastal erosion eating away at cemetery boundaries, emergency cleanups that strain municipal budgets. Poorly planned older cemeteries will be especially vulnerable. 7, inequality that becomes harder to manage. We talked earlier about wealth disparity in cemeteries. Future administrators will inherit grand, expensive mausoleums of wealthy families, crumbling simple graves of poorer families. They will face uncomfortable questions like, do we spend public money preserving private family mausoleums? Do we treat all graves equally or prioritize historically important ones? What happens to the graves of people whose families can't advocate for them? This turns cemetery management into a social justice issue, not just a logistical one. Part 2. How they will probably get through it, the likely path forward. None of this is easy, but there are realistic ways forward. Number 1. Gradual normalization of cremation. This is almost inevitable. Over the next 50 to 100 years, Puerto Rico will likely encourage cremation through lower costs, make it the default option in many cases, build more columbariums, urn walls, instead of body vaults. They won't force it overnight, but they'll slowly make it the practical norm. Culturally, this will be framed as honoring the dead in a new way, not abandoning tradition, still allowing families to visit, decorate, and remember. 2. Formalized grave reuse policies. This will be one of the most delicate but necessary changes. Future cemeteries will likely set clear time limits on body burials, e.g., 25 to 50 years. After that, allow remains to be moved to smaller niches, ossuaries, communal resting places, or urns for family keeping. They'll present this not as erasure, but as transition rather than disappearance. Number 3, vertical cemeteries instead of sprawling ones. Instead of expanding outward, Puerto Rico will likely build upward. Taller walls of niches, multi-level columbariums, more compact modern cemetery designs. Some new cemeteries may look more like memorial buildings rather than open fields of graves. This maximizes limited land while keeping burial practices centralized. Number 4, preservation of historic cemeteries, closure to new burials. Iconic sites like Santa Maria Magdalena de Pazis, Old San Juan, Ponce Civil Cemetery will likely be treated as protected historical landmarks, open-air museums, cultural heritage sites. They'll stop accepting new burials and focus on conservation instead. New burials will move elsewhere or shift to cremation. 5. Tougher regulations and better planning. Future cemetery management will almost certainly become more bureaucratic and planned. Expect clearer burial contracts, stricter maintenance requirements, time limits on plot usage, better record keeping of who is buried where, more professional engineering standards for tomb construction. This is where they will directly confront the poor planning of the past. Number 6, public education to reduce backlash. A huge part of getting through this will be changing public attitudes. Authorities will likely have to explain why space is limited, show that cremation or grave reuse can still be respectful, involve communities and religious leaders in the conversation. If they don't do this carefully, there will be major public resistance. The deeper truth behind your observation. What you're really seeing is this. Puerto Rico built its cemeteries on assumptions of permanence, strong family attachment to specific tombs, a tradition that never anticipated extreme land scarcity. Now reality is catching up. So yes, future cemetery managers will inherit overcrowding, aging infrastructure, legal ambiguity, cultural resistance, environmental risk. But they will likely navigate it through more cremation, smarter, denser cemetery design, clearer laws, selective preservation of historic sites.
So I guess my question now is how could the people that were planning and in charge of a lot of these cemeteries over the last 80 to 120 years, how did they not realize that they were creating something that was really going to be a huge problem in the future and that was virtually unsustainable? I just don't see how somebody that was in charge of a cemetery in, let's say, like 1963, how could they not see that a disaster was coming around the corner? You know, with everything we've talked about, just me looking at it in hindsight now, it seems pretty obvious, but I'm just wondering, like, what do you think they were thinking back in the day?
Sophisticated question. On the surface, it does look obvious. If land is limited and people keep dying, why didn't anyone plan better? The answer isn't that past cemetery authorities were simply foolish. It's that they were operating inside very different assumptions, pressures, and realities than we have today. When you reconstruct their world, their decisions make a lot more sense, even if they created problems for the future. Below is a deep, honest explanation of why this happened. The short, blunt answer. Most of the people in charge over the last 100 years could not see the problem the way you do now because 1. Puerto Rico looked demographically, economically, and politically very different. 2. Their planning horizon was much shorter than 100 years. 3. Cultural and religious assumptions made permanent tombs seem natural and unquestionable. 4. They were constantly dealing with more immediate crises. 5. The modern concept of finite land plus environmental limits wasn't part of their worldview. Now let's unpack that carefully. Number 1. They lived in a very different Puerto Rico. If you went back to 1920, 1940, or even 1960, Puerto Rico was far more rural. Many people lived on farms or in small towns. Large parts of the island felt open or underdeveloped. Urban density was much lower than today. From their perspective, land did not feel scarce the way it does now. Cemetery planners in, say, 1935 were thinking, open quote, we can always expand later, close quote. They weren't imagining massive urban sprawl, tourism development, environmental protections, the modern real estate market, people crowding coastal and historic areas. So the problem didn't look urgent or inevitable to them. Now, 2, they did not think in 100-year time horizons. Modern urban planners sometimes think in terms of 50, 100-year growth, sustainability, long-term resource limits. But for much of the 20th century, municipal cemetery management in Puerto Rico was far more short-term and practical. They were thinking, we need space for the next 10 to 20 years. How do we handle burials right now? How do we recover after the last hurricane? How do we serve today's families? Not, open quote, what will happen in 2126? Close quote. In other words, they were solving immediate problems, not distant hypothetical ones. Number 3, cultural assumptions made permanent tombs feel normal. This is huge. For generations, Puerto Ricans, like many Catholic societies, assumed that burial in a concrete tomb was basically permanent. Families would always exist to care for those tombs. Cemeteries were sacred, stable places that should not change much. No one seriously imagined widespread cremation, large-scale grave reuse, cemeteries turning into historic museums, families abandoning tombs en masse. Your question comes from a modern mindset that says, open quote, space is limited, systems must be sustainable, close quote. Their mindset was closer to, open quote, we honor our dead with permanence, close quote. That cultural belief made long-term overcrowding feel almost unthinkable. 4, they were constantly dealing with crises. If you look at Puerto Rico's last century, cemetery authorities were not operating in calm, predictable conditions. They faced the Great Depression, massive poverty in rural areas, migration waves to the U.S., political changes, Spanish-U.S. control, hurricanes, San Felipe 1928, San Ciprian 1932, many others, economic booms and busts, limited municipal budgets. When your town is struggling to provide clean water, fix roads, recover from storms, maintain basic services, long-term cemetery planning tends to fall low on the priority list. They were often just trying to keep cemeteries functional, not redesign them for the next century. Number 5, they underestimated population change and migration. For much of the 20th century, Puerto Rico's population grew rapidly. Planners often underestimated how many people would live in cities, underestimated how crowded cemeteries would become, didn't anticipate how many families would stay attached to old tombs. At the same time, they also didn't fully predict modern migration patterns, where many families moved to the mainland U.S. Tombs were left behind without caretakers. Cemeteries filled up faster than families could maintain them. So both population growth and diaspora created pressures they didn't foresee. Number 6, they trusted tradition more than data. Modern planning relies heavily on demographics, projections, environmental limits, long-term modeling. Much of 20th century cemetery management in Puerto Rico was more tradition-based than data-based. Decisions were guided by Catholic custom, Spanish colonial precedent, what had always been done, not by spreadsheets predicting cemetery capacity in 2075. So the system grew organically rather than strategically. Number 7, land was treated as something that could always be found. Until relatively recently, the assumption was, open quote, If we need more space, we'll build another cemetery. Close quote. That assumption worked when towns were smaller, land was cheaper, development was slower, but over time, urban areas expanded, tourism grew, environmental protections increased, real estate became more valuable. Suddenly, just build another cemetery was no longer simple or affordable. Past planners didn't anticipate that shift. They didn't foresee cultural resistance to change. Even if some forward thinking officials did see potential problems, they likely assumed families would eventually accept new burial methods. People would adapt if space ran out. What they didn't fully predict was how emotionally attached people would remain to concrete tombs, how politically difficult it would be to reclaim graves, how controversial cremation or grave reuse would feel to many families. So even well-intentioned planning would have been politically risky. So were they negligent? Here's the balanced way to look at it. They did make mistakes. It's fair to say that long-term planning was weak, record keeping was often poor, some cemeteries were poorly designed, infrastructure wasn't built for centuries of use. In that sense, yes, future generations inherited avoidable problems, but they were not irrational or careless, given their cultural worldview, economic constraints, political realities, limited tools and data, short-term pressures. Their decisions were actually quite reasonable at the time. They weren't failing to see the future. They were operating inside a very different historical moment. Your perspective is actually very modern. Your question reflects a contemporary mindset that emphasizes sustainability, finite resources, long-term planning, systems thinking. That way of thinking is relatively new in human history. If you had asked someone in 1940, open quote, what will cemeteries look like in 2126, close quote, they likely would have said, open quote, more or less the same as now, close quote. You're seeing the limits of that assumption.